Have you ever wondered what happens when a nation decides that the blood of their ancestors has paid enough for the wealth of others? This is not a dry political story. This is an indictment written in fire, a declaration of war from the heart of Africa, where a 34-year-old captain dared to look one of the world's mightiest powers in the eye and say, "Get out." His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and his actions are not only shaking the Élysée Palace in Paris, but are also redrawing the map of global power. This is the story of an uncompromising confrontation, a battle between the legacy of the colonized and the arrogance of the colonizer. A battle where the past is never, ever dead. If you have ever felt trampled on and have yearned to stand up, hit that like button to add your strength to this journey for justice. To understand the fire in Traoré's eyes, we must go back in time. Not just a few years, but more than a century. Back to a time when his homeland wasn't even allowed to bear its own name. Before it became Burkina Faso, the land of upright people, it was called Upper Volta, a name given by the French, the mark of a conqueror on a stolen land. Today's conflict between Traoré and Macron wasn't born in 2022. It was born in the late 19th century, during the frenzied scramble for Africa, when European powers tore apart a rich continent like vultures. France planted its flag on this land, redrawing borders with a cold ruler, splitting tribes, and shattering traditional societies that were thousands of years old. They didn't come to enlighten, they came to exploit. And from that original wound, a poison called colonialism began to spread pain, loss, and a simmering hatred waiting for its day to erupt. That poison, once it soaks into the soil, taints everything that grows from it. Life under French rule wasn't just a loss of freedom, it was a full-blown assault on human dignity. Imagine being born in the land of your own ancestors, only to be treated as a second-class citizen. The blood and sweat of the Burkinabe people watered the cotton fields and dug deep into the earth to pull up every precious ounce of gold. But that wealth didn't flow back to build their villages, schools, or hospitals. No, it was loaded onto ships and sent thousands of miles across the sea to fill the treasuries in Paris, to adorn the magnificent boulevards of a foreign land. The people were subjected to forced labor, a system called corvée, to build roads and railways. But make no mistake, these roads weren't for farmers to easily bring their goods to market. They were built for French trucks, so they could transport plundered resources more efficiently. The schools that were built weren't to enlighten a generation, but to create a small, native ruling class, trained to serve French interests, to become overseers of their own people. It was a perfectly oiled colonial machine, where human beings were just another resource to be squeezed dry and discarded. And then, 1960 arrived. The French flag was lowered. The flag of Upper Volta was raised. Cries of independence echoed everywhere. The world applauded. But for many, it was just an elaborate stage play. The visible iron chains had been removed, only to be replaced by invisible strings, more subtle and more cruel. Welcome to the era of France-Afrique, colonialism with a new mask. France-Afrique is not a conspiracy theory. It is a well-documented system of economic, political, and military control. The heart of this beast was the CFA franc currency. For an American, imagine this. You work hard and earn $100. But the law forces you to send 50 of those dollars to an account in the French central bank in Paris. That's not your savings. It's a mandatory reserve. If your country wants to invest in a major project, like a dam or a power plant, you can't just use your own money. You have to borrow your own money back from France, often with strict conditions attached. France held your economic destiny in its hands. They could devalue your currency overnight, making everything more expensive and plunging millions into misery. This wasn't a partnership. It was a master-servant relationship. Meanwhile, French corporations continued to dominate every lucrative industry. From gold and uranium mining to telecommunications and banking, names like Total, Orange, and major French banks siphoned profits out of the Burkinabe economy, leaving very little for the local people. And to ensure this system ran smoothly, France maintained military bases across the region. They claimed it was to preserve stability, but the people saw French soldiers protecting French mines, propping up pro-French dictators and ready to intervene if any patriotic leader dared to challenge the established order. This was a prison without bars, where nations had anthems, flags, and a seat at the UN, but no real sovereignty. Burkina Faso wasn't a sovereign nation. It was a business asset, with a flag on it. Independence was an illusion, a betrayed promise. The resentment never disappeared. It just simmered, burning beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to name the poison and find the antidote. And that person was about to appear. Music swells with hope and inspiration, and then, through the suffocating darkness of control, a shooting star blazed across the sky. His name was Thomas Sankara. In 1983, this young, charismatic, and incorruptible captain took power, and for a brief, fleeting moment of just 4 years, he showed Burkina Faso and the world that another future was possible. Sankara wasn't a politician. He was a revolutionary, a hurricane sweeping across the arid land, bringing with him the rain of hope and pride. His first and most symbolic act? Erasing the colonial name Upper Volta and giving birth to the name Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. This wasn't just a name change. It was a rebirth. It was a defiant declaration that they would no longer be a shadow of Paris, but would stand tall on their own 2 feet. Sankara's revolution touched every corner of life. He launched an uncompromising war on corruption, selling off the government's fleet of luxury Mercedes and replacing them with Renault 5 Second, the cheapest cars at the time. A minister cannot live in greater luxury than the people he serves, he said. He refused to install an air conditioner in his office, saying he couldn't enjoy such a luxury when most of his people didn't have enough to eat. He told his people to dare to invent the future. He launched a campaign to consume what we produce. Civil servants were required to wear the Faso Dan Fani, a traditional cotton fabric from Burkina Faso, instead of expensive suits imported from Europe. This was a direct blow to the dependent economy France had so carefully constructed. He empowered women, banning female genital mutilation and forced marriages, and appointing women to high-level government positions, which was unprecedented. He led one of the most successful vaccination campaigns in African history, inoculating 2.5 million children in just a few weeks. He planted over 10 million trees to combat desertification. He was an environmentalist, a feminist, a champion of the poor, all before those concepts became global trends. But it was his bluntness on the world stage that sealed his fate. Before the United Nations, Sankara unapologetically exposed the debt system, which he called neocolonialism. He declared that Africa could not and would not pay a debt it did not create, a debt rooted in colonial exploitation itself. He became a threat. His success would be a dangerous example. If Burkina Faso could stand on its own, why couldn't other nations? They couldn't debate him, so they decided they had to silence him. On the 15th of October, 1987, tragedy struck. Thomas Sankara, the people's hero, was assassinated in a bloody coup. The leader of the coup was none other than his closest comrade, Blaise Compaoré, who would go on to rule for 27 years, quickly reversing all of Sankara's policies and welcoming Paris back with open arms. Though no official proof has ever been presented in an international court, in the hearts of millions of Africans and freedom lovers around the world, one truth is undeniable. Paris pulled the strings. They killed the man to kill the dream. That dream was thought to be buried with his body. But they were wrong. You can kill a revolutionary, but you cannot kill the revolution. Sankara's legacy became a legend, a torch passed from one generation to the next. And now, nearly 4 decades later, another young captain, Ibrahim Traoré, is picking up that torch. If you've ever believed in a dream, in an ideal, only to see it brutally betrayed, share the number 1987 in the comments, as a tribute to a fallen hero and the fire he lit. The look in Traoré's eyes doesn't just hold his own anger. It holds the ghost of Thomas Sankara, who has returned to reclaim what was stolen. The ghost of Thomas Sankara didn't just linger in the air, it found a living body. In September 2022, as Burkina Faso was drowning in violence and despair, an almost unknown face emerged. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, age 34, led a coup within a coup. The previous military government was seen as too soft, too ineffective, and worst of all, still too close to Paris. The people had lost patience. The country was collapsing, and they needed someone who dared to act, understand the hellish context at the time. Over 40% of Burkina Faso's territory had fallen to jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Thousands were dead, millions were displaced from their homes. Gunmen attacked villages almost daily, slaughtering men, women, and children indiscriminately. Amidst this chaos, a nagging question was whispered in markets and military bases. Why? After nearly a decade with 400 of France's elite special forces on the ground, with drones, satellites, and the most advanced military technology, why was the situation worse than ever? The people and soldiers of Burkina Faso began to suspect the French presence was no longer seen as protection, but as part of the problem. How can one of the world's most modern armies fail to defeat groups of rebels on motorcycles? They asked. Or do they not want to defeat them? A more bitter theory began to spread. Perhaps this instability was the perfect excuse for France to maintain its military presence and control over the region's resources. Right or wrong, faith in Paris had completely shattered. And that's when Traoré made his move. In January 2023, his government did the unthinkable. They issued an ultimatum, giving France 1 month to withdraw all of its troops from Burkina territory. 1 month. Imagine the audacity. A young captain from one of the world's poorest countries was ordering a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, to pack its bags. This wasn't a diplomatic request. This was a slap in the face. This was David telling Goliath, "This land is ours. Get out of here." The news sent an earthquake through Paris. The Élysée Palace was stunned. To them, it was an unforgivable betrayal. But in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the streets erupted. Thousands poured out to celebrate, waving Burkinabe flags and, most noticeably, Russian flags. They burned French flags. They chanted Traoré's name. This was the will of a people who had been suppressed for far too long. The showdown was now personal. On one side, Ibrahim Traoré, the quiet soldier, always in his fatigues, whose actions speak louder than his words. He represents a raw, uncompromising nationalism forged in the fires of the battlefield. On the other side, Emmanuel Macron, the Jupiterian president, a polished product of France's elite schools, who speaks of partnership but exudes an air of paternalistic condescension. One man wants to break the chains. The other, whether well-intentioned or not, wants to hold on to those invisible strings. Kicking out the army was just the first shot. The real war was just beginning. Macron's next move would be a fatal mistake, one that poured gasoline on the raging fire of resentment. That fire didn't have to wait long. The mistake came not from a military decision, but from something far more dangerous: words. At an international summit, under the glare of stage lights, the French president, feeling cornered by the rising tide of anti-French sentiment, decided to hit back. He spoke of development aid, of fallen French soldiers, of Paris's efforts. And then, in a moment of unconcealed frustration, in a tone dripping with paternalism, he uttered the fateful word. He called the African nations who dared to question France's help ungrateful. One word. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The word ungrateful hung in the air, toxic and heavy. To Western diplomats, it might have been a mere slip of the tongue, but to billions of Africans, it was the confirmation of everything they had always suspected. It was the voice of the old master, who still believes he has the right to judge, that the exploited should be thankful for the crumbs thrown their way. The news spread like wildfire on social media. Rage erupted from Dakar to Djibouti. Macron hadn't put out the fire. He had thrown a napalm bomb on it. And in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traore was watching. This was the opening he was waiting for. Macron had handed him a weapon more powerful than any missile. He had turned Traoré from the leader of a small nation into the voice of dignity for an entire continent. Traoré appeared on national television. Still in his familiar fatigues, the Burkinabe flag behind him, he stared straight into the camera, his eyes unwavering. His voice was calm, but every word was a dagger. "The French president speaks of ingratitude," he began. "I want to say to him, and to the world, if there is anyone who is ungrateful, it is him." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he delivered the finishing blow, a historical punch that no French diplomat could parry. "The France of today exists," he continued, his voice hardening, "because of the blood and bones of our ancestors. Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers, the tirailleurs, were pulled from their villages to fight and die in the muddy fields of Europe in 2 world wars. They fought for a flag that was not theirs, for a freedom they themselves would never enjoy. They saved France from destruction not once, but twice. And when the wars ended, they returned home to find their own countries were still colonies. They should be thanking us. They owe us a debt that can never be repaid, not insult us with the word ungrateful. This was no longer a political dispute. This was the verdict of history." Traoré had awakened the memory of the forgotten soldiers who sacrificed themselves for a mother country only to be betrayed. And he didn't stop at words. He immediately called on all self-respecting African nations to tear up their military cooperation agreements with France. He then ordered a ban on French state media outlets like France 24 and RFI, accusing them of being propaganda tools. He was cutting the strings, one by one. The diplomatic bridge was burned. There was no turning back. The battle between Traoré and Macron had become a war for the very soul of Africa. And in this war, one side had found a new ally, a giant waiting in the east. When a bridge is burned, you have to find another path. Spurned by Paris, Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. Because he knew, in the ruthless game of geopolitics, when one empire retreats, another is always ready to fill the void. And the giant waiting in the east, with an enigmatic smile, was Russia. To many Westerners, Burkina Faso's pivot to Russia is baffling, even suicidal. But for Traoré and many Africans, it's a perfectly logical choice. Why? The answer lies in an advantage Russia has, that France never will: a clean past. Russia was never a colonial power in Africa. They carry no historical baggage of conquest, massacres, or centuries of exploitation. They can walk into Africa as a partner, a liberator from Western neo-colonialism, not as a returning former master. And Russia doesn't come with empty promises of democracy or lectures on human rights. They come with what Traoré needs immediately: weapons, military advisors, and soldiers ready to fight. Enter the Wagner Group, or its rebranded name, the Africa Corps. These are not UN peacekeepers. They are soldiers of the shadows, ruthlessly effective mercenaries who operate by their own rules. They fill the security vacuum left by the French, providing the support Traoré believes will bring results on the battlefield. The deal, though not public, is brutally clear. Traoré gets the military muscle to destroy the jihadist groups. In return, Russia gets access. Access to strategic mineral resources, especially the gold that Burkina Faso has in abundance. And, more importantly, they get an ally, a firm foothold in the heart of a region where the West is rapidly losing influence. It is a purely transactional relationship. You help me solve my problem, I'll help you solve yours. For a soldier like Traoré, that brutal honesty is perhaps more trustworthy than France's flowery words of friendship. But this is where the great debate begins, the fateful question for Burkina Faso's future. Is Traoré making a deal with the devil? His supporters argue it's a necessary, pragmatic move. The West gave us lectures and failure for a decade, they say. Russia gives us guns and results. We are fighting for national survival, and we will take help from wherever we can get it. At least they treat us as equal partners, not as children to be lectured. But skeptical voices, both at home and abroad, paint a darker picture. Are you truly free? Or have you just changed the name on your chains? They warn. Wagner mercenaries don't work for free. Today they fight your enemies. Tomorrow they will be the masters of your gold mines. You are jumping from the French frying pan into the Russian fire. This is the biggest gamble of Ibrahim Traoré's life. He is betting his country's entire future on a new, powerful, but incredibly dangerous alliance. Is he a visionary patriot, securing his nation's future by any means necessary? Or a reckless gambler, making a deal that will eventually consume both him and his country? The answer is not yet written, and the price of this new alliance is still being calculated, perhaps in barrels of gold and in drops of blood. While analysts in Washington, Paris, and Moscow move chess pieces on a world map, on the ground in Burkina Faso, the reality is far harsher than any headline. For 23 million people, switching allies from France to Russia doesn't mean bread magically appears on the table, or that the sound of gunfire stops in the countryside. On the security front, the reality has been a cold shower. Despite the arrival of Russian advisors, jihadist violence has not decreased. In fact, it has gotten worse. In 2024 alone, more than 1,500 lives were lost in brutal attacks. For a farmer in a remote village, it doesn't matter which flag flies over the presidential palace if he fears his family will be attacked tonight. The promise of security, the main reason for the people's support for Traoré, is being severely tested. But perhaps the fiercest battle is the one against hunger. Here is a fact that shocks most Western audiences. The majority of people in Burkina Faso are struggling to survive on an income of less than $900 a year. Let me say that again, $900 for an entire year. That's less than $2.50 a day. Imagine trying to feed your family on that. Worse, Traoré's hardline stance against the West risks turning Burkina Faso into an isolated island. The European Union, once a major humanitarian donor, is considering cutting aid. In real terms, that means less money for clinics, less funding for schools, and less food aid for millions of displaced people. Traoré is walking a razor's edge. He has won national pride, but the cost could be his people's prosperity. He told the world Burkina Faso is not a beggar, but without outside help, will his people starve. So, in the hearts of the Burkinabe people, there is a conflict. On one hand, there is undeniable pride. For the first time in generations, they feel they are in control of their own destiny. On the other hand, there is a tangible fear. Fear of attacks, fear of hunger, and fear of an uncertain future. Can national pride be eaten? Can independence warm a cold hut at night? For 23 million people in Burkina Faso, these are not philosophical questions. They are their grim daily reality. Ibrahim Traoré's rebellion is not an isolated event. It's a spark thrown onto a dry field. The fire he lit in Ouagadougou has quickly spread, creating what analysts now call the coup belt of the Sahel. To the west is Mali, and to the east is Niger, two other nations that have seen young military governments oust French troops and turn to Russia for support. Together, these three nations have formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a new military and political bloc, an alliance of rebels. This is a nightmare come true for Paris. Macron's entire Africa strategy has collapsed like a sandcastle. Geopolitically, they have lost control of a strategic region. Economically, billions of dollars in interests are under threat. The uranium from Niger, critical for France's nuclear power plants, is now in the hands of a hostile government. The era of Françafrique appears to be coming to a painful and irreversible end. But for Africa, this moment is both a historic opportunity and a risky gamble. Traoré's defiance has inspired a new generation tired of being treated as Europe's backyard. The message is clear. We want real sovereignty, not just from France, but from all foreign powers. However, the path ahead is full of thorns. Turning to Russia may bring quick wins, but it risks trapping them in a new kind of dependency. Russia is also a power hungry for resources and influence, and real economic freedom is still out of reach. You can expel soldiers, but how do you escape a global financial system still dominated by the dollar and Western institutions? The fight for political independence may be won with guns and courage, but the fight for economic independence requires a much longer, more complex war. Africa is writing a new chapter in its history, one where it refuses to be a pawn on anyone's chessboard. But the great question remains, will this push for independence lead to real power and prosperity, or just to new struggles under new masters? In the end, the confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Emmanuel Macron is more than a story of two men. It is a clash of history, of ideology, and of opposing visions for Africa's future. Traoré's animosity towards France is forged from a painful colonial legacy fueled by decades of economic and military control and set ablaze by the undying fire of his hero, Thomas Sankara. Whether he succeeds or fails, Traoré has forced a critical global conversation. He has challenged the old order and inspired a generation to dream of a real independence, not just one on paper. His story is a powerful reminder that the road to freedom is always paved with peril, and that courage, while it lights the way, does not guarantee a happy ending. So what do you think? Is Traoré a patriotic hero or a reckless gambler? Is Burkina Faso truly better off without France? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and the struggle for self-determination has moved you, hit the like button to spread the message. And most importantly, if you believe every nation has the right to write its own history, hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us as we continue to explore the stories that shape our world.